there is belief, and then there is skepticism. And between those two lies a vast territory of questions and the unknown. But what if reality is far more complex than we've been willing to perceive? And what if the stories that we dismiss as myth and legend hold the keys to understanding consciousness? From ghostly encounters to mysterious lights in the sky, humanity has always sensed there was something more out there. Some call it the paranormal, and others call it the divine. Some search the stars for answers, while others look within. They are all connected, threads in the grand tapestry of life. But we stand at a place where the fabric between realities is much thinner than you might think, because this is Crossroads of the Veil. We are not alone. It is a phrase that has become a cliché, worn down by decades of sci-fi movies and tabloid headlines. We usually associate the moment that phrase became real was the moment the government actually got its hands on the proof in the scorching desert sands of New Mexico, Roswell, 1947. But what if I told you that the clock didn't start in 1947? What if the timeline we have been fed for nearly a century is off by 14 years? What if the first contact didn't happen under the watchful eyes of American democracy, but in the shadow of rising fascism? Welcome to the Crossroads. Today we are tearing up the history books. We are going back to a time before the atomic bomb, before the Cold War, and before the term flying saucer even existed. We are going to northern Italy. The date is June 13th, 1933. And something has just fallen out of the sky that is going to terrify a dictator, mobilize the Vatican, and eventually change the course of American secrecy forever. This is the story of the Magenta crash. To understand why this story has remained buried for so long, hidden under layers of bureaucratic concrete so thick that it took a high-level U.S. intelligence officer turning whistleblower in 2023 to bring it back to the surface, we have to understand the world of 1933. Europe is a powder keg. Adolf Hitler has just been appointed Chancellor of Germany in January. The world is holding its breath, waiting for the spark of war. In Italy, Benito Mussolini is at the height of his power. He is obsessed with projecting strength, obsessed with Italian technological superiority. He wants the world to believe that Italy is the successor to the Roman Empire, a fortress of steel and will. And then on a misty morning in June, the universe throws a wrench into his propaganda machine. We are in the Lombardy region, near the town of Magenta. It's early morning. The air is cool, heavy with the humidity of the Po Valley. This is an industrial and agricultural heartland. People here are used to the sounds of early aviation, because Italy was a pioneer in aeronautics at the time. The drone of a biplane engine wouldn't be unusual. But the sound that tears through the sky on June 13th isn't the rhythmic chugging of a combustion engine. It is described later in fragmented reports and leaked documents as something different. A tearing sound, a displacement of air so violent it rattled windows. And then, the impact. The crash site isn't in a desolate desert like Roswell. It's uncomfortably close to civilization. Workers, farmers, and early risers are the first on the scene. Now I want you to put yourself in their shoes. You are an Italian laborer in 1933. You have no concept of aliens in the modern sense. You don't have Spielberg movies in your cultural reference points. If you see something fall from the sky, you think airplane. You think pilot. You think help. So they rush toward the smoke. They rush toward the crater in the earth, expecting to find canvas wings, twisted propellers, maybe even the broken body of a fellow countryman. But that is not what they find. According to the documents that would surface decades later, the object lodged in the Italian soil does not have wings. It does not have a tail. It does not have a propeller. It is described as cylindrical or bell-shaped. One of the most specific descriptions to come out of the investigation refers to the shape as resembling two saucers joined together or a flattened bell. It is metallic, grayish, and huge, estimated around 30 to 50 feet in diameter. It is sitting there steaming in the morning light, utterly alien to the design language of 1930s Earth. The locals stare at it. There is no swastika on the side, no Italian tricolor flag, no markings that make sense. just this smooth, seamless geometric impossibility. This is the moment of high strangeness. In ufology, we talk about the psychological impact of the phenomenon. The brain tries to reject what it sees. The witnesses likely tried to rationalize it. Is it a boiler, a tank, a secret weapon? But the metallic skin of the craft, it's all wrong. It doesn't crumple like the aluminum or canvas of the era. It looks, for lack of a better word, advanced. Now, usually in these stories, the military arrives instantly. But in 1933, communication was slower. There is a window of time, perhaps an hour or two, where this object belongs to the people of Magenta. They are touching it, walking around it. There are rumors, persistent whispers that have survived for 90 years, of bodies, not human bodies, 2 of them. However, we need to be careful here. We want to stick to the highest probability of truth. The whistleblower David Grusch, who briefed the United States Congress on this, stated that the Italians recovered a partially intact vehicle. He was careful regarding the biologics in this specific case. However, the Italian researcher Roberto Pinotti, who received the leak of the original files in 1996, noted sketches and descriptions that imply the pilots were unique, described in some margin notes as having Nordic features: blonde, tall, human-like but clearly not human. This led to a fascinating but terrifying confusion later on, where the Italians thought they might be German pilots, adding to the geopolitical mess. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the crash site. The word spreads. The local carabinieri, military police, are alerted. Calls are made, and this is where the machinery of the fascist state kicks into gear. Mussolini's government was effectively a police state. They had ears everywhere. When the report comes in, an unknown aircraft, circular, no wings, crashed in Magenta, it goes to the intelligence services. Within hours, the site is swarming, but not just with local police. We see the arrival of the OVRA, Mussolini's secret police. Imagine the change in atmosphere. The helpful farmers are pushed back with rifle butts. A perimeter is established. The friendly curiosity of the morning is replaced by cold, hard authoritarianism. This is the crucial pivot point. In Roswell, the Army Air Force put out a press release, saying they found a flying disc and then retracted it the next day. They fumbled it. The Italians. They didn't fumble. They went straight to the nuclear option of censorship. We know this because of the Mr. X documents. In 1996, Roberto Pinotti, a leading Italian aerospace journalist and UFO researcher, received a package in the mail, anonymous, no return address. Inside were documents that looked old, yellowed paper, specific ink, correct letterheads from the 1930s. Forensic analysis later supported their age. These weren't laser-printed fakes. They were telegrams, authentic government communiques from the Agenzia Stefani, the official press agency of the fascist regime. We will dive deep into the text of these telegrams later, but I want to highlight the immediate reaction right now. The order that came down from Rome was absolute. It wasn't just don't talk about it. It was a direct threat to national security. The telegrams ordered the immediate recovery of the object. They ordered the silencing of witnesses. But most importantly, they ordered the creation of a cover story that was so flimsy, yet so mandatory, that it shows how desperate they were. They were told to say it was a meteor. A meteor is a rock. It leaves a crater. It doesn't leave a 50-foot metal bell with internal structure and portholes. It doesn't leave bodies. The fact that they chose a meteor tells us they didn't want anyone looking for a plane. If they said plane crash, reporters would ask whose plane. They would look for a pilot. But by saying meteor, they were trying to classify it as a natural disaster. Nothing to see here, just a rock from space. Move along. But the recovery operation itself was a nightmare. Moving a 50-foot object in 1933 isn't easy. You don't have heavy lift helicopters. You have trucks, ropes, and manpower. They had to drag this thing, or dismantle it, under the cover of tarps and secrecy. Where did they take it? This is where the story connects to the modern day. The object was reportedly moved to the SIA Marchetti hangars in Vergit. This was a premier aircraft manufacturing facility. It makes sense. If you find an advanced machine, you take it to your best engineers. You don't take it to a biologist. You take it to the people who build planes. Mussolini didn't think he had caught an alien. He thought he had caught a secret weapon from a European rival. His ego wouldn't allow him to believe he was outgunned by Martians. He was paranoid about the French. He was wary of the British. He looked at this bell-shaped craft with its seamless metal and no rivets, and he didn't see the stars. He saw the next war. He saw a weapon that could wipe Italy off the map if he didn't figure out how it worked first. This misidentification, this belief that the UFO was a terrestrial weapon, is the key to the whole cover-up. It's why RS-33 was formed. It's why the silence was so brutal. They weren't hiding aliens to prevent panic, they were hiding enemy tech to prevent looking weak. But as the engineers at the SIAI Marchetti hangar pulled back the tarps, as they ran their hands over the cold, frictionless surface of the hull, the realization must have set in. The realization that no French factory could build this, that no British engineer designed this. The rivets were missing, the propulsion was missing, the controls were intelligible. As the sun set on June 13, 1933, the world had forever changed, but only a handful of men in black shirts knew it. The people of Magenta were told to forget what they saw. The press was gagged. The object was hidden in a hangar, waiting for the best minds in Italy to fail at understanding it. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially when the secret is too big for one nation to hold. The crash was over. The retrieval was underway. But the cover-up was just beginning, and the document that would seal the lips of an entire nation was already being typed out on a typewriter in Rome. A document that would threaten death to anyone who dared to speak the truth. They thought they could bury it. They thought they could hide the bell in the fog of history. But they were wrong. Words have power. In the digital age, we are used to information flowing like water, leaking through every crack in the dam. If a government wants to hide something today, they have to flood the zone with noise. They create conflicting narratives and misinformation until the truth is just one needle in a stack of identical needles. But in 1933, information was solid. It traveled on paper. It traveled through copper wires. And in fascist Italy, every inch of that paper and every mile of that wire was held in the iron grip of one man, Benito Mussolini. We are standing in the immediate aftermath of the Magenta crash. The smoke was still rising. The locals were confused. The strange bell-shaped object was sitting in the mud, a silent testament to a technology that shouldn't exist. But while the physical recovery was a logistical nightmare of trucks and tarps, the informational recovery was a surgical strike. Now we are going to dissect the cover-up, not the clumsy panic cover-ups we see in movies, but a cold, bureaucratic erasure of reality. We are going to look at the documents that prove that the Italian government knew they had something world-shattering, and they were willing to destroy anyone who talked about it. We are talking about the Stefani telegrams. To understand the weight of these documents, you have to understand the Agenzia Stefani. This wasn't just a news wire, it was the central nervous system of the fascist state. Under Mussolini, the press wasn't a watchdog, it was a megaphone for the regime. Every headline, every byline, every radio broadcast was curated to serve that image. So, when the reports of the crash started filtering in from Lombardy on that June morning, the system didn't just blink, it froze. Imagine the telegraph operator in Rome. It's late afternoon. The initial confusion has settled into a terrifying clarity. The reports aren't talking about a biplane or a French bomber. They are talking about a metallic object with no wings. The order that comes down from the top isn't a request. It is a command that carries the weight of execution. We know exactly what these orders said because 60 years later, in 1996, the Mr. X package arrived on the desk of researcher Roberto Pinotti. Inside were the original telegraph slips, not copies. The actual paper yellowed by time, smelling of the archives. Let's look at the first telegram. It was sent at 4 p.m. on June 13, 1933. The text is chilling. It is addressed to all prefects, all questors, and essentially every layer of the Italian security apparatus. That message was silence regarding the alleged landing of unknown aircraft on national soil. Even in their internal panic, they are trying to distance themselves from the reality. But the second part of the message is where the teeth are. It orders the immediate cessation of any news reporting. It orders the confiscation of any photographs. But it's the follow-up instructions that reveal the true level of panic. The second telegram sent shortly after instructs the press to reframe the event. The aircraft is to be referred to strictly as a celestial phenomenon, a meteor, a falling star, a natural event. Think about the psychology of this. If you tell the public it was a secret weapon, you incite curiosity. Spies will come looking. Journalists will dig. But if you say it was a rock from space, people lose interest. Rocks are boring. Rocks don't have pilots, and rocks don't have technology. This was a masterstroke of counterintelligence. By classifying the most advanced technological discovery in human history as a stone, Mussolini made it invisible. But the telegrams go further. They contain a phrase that should send a shiver down your spine. Personal orders of Mussolini. In 1933 Italy, this was the equivalent of a divine commandment. When an order came directly from Mussolini, it bypassed all bureaucracy. It meant that this wasn't just a military matter, it was a matter of the dictator's personal survival. And then comes the threat. The telegrams explicitly state that any infraction will be met with a tribunal for the security of the state. This wasn't a court where you got a lawyer and a fair trial. This was a court where you disappeared. The telegrams warned that spreading news of the nature and origin of the aircraft would be considered a crime against the state. They were equating talking about a UFO with treason. But why take such extreme measures? We have to step into Mussolini's mind. We often caricature him as a pompous buffoon, the man on the balcony with the jutting jaw. But he was a cunning operator. He knew that his power rested on the perception of Italian strength. If he admitted that a craft had crashed in Lombardy that was superior to anything the Italian Air Force possessed, it would be an admission of vulnerability. But there is a darker layer. The document suggests that Mussolini initially believed this was a weapon, not from Mars, but from Earth. He was terrified that the French or the British had developed a secret weapon that could penetrate Italian airspace with impunity. The unknown aircraft represented an existential threat to his regime. If the British had silent wingless bombers, the war was lost before it began. So the cover-up wasn't just about hiding aliens, it was about hiding fear. Let's go back to the Mr. X documents for a moment. When Pinotti received them, the skepticism was high. In ufology, fake documents are the currency of the realm. The majestic 12 documents, for example, have been debated for decades. But the Stephanie telegrams were different. Forensic analysis was conducted on the paper and the ink. The paper was consistent with the cellulose mixtures used in the 1930s. Paper that ages in a very specific way, yellowing from the edges inward due to oxidation. The ink was not modern ballpoint or laser toner, it was the ribbon ink of a 1930s teletype machine. Furthermore, the style of the language, the bureaucratic fascist jargon, was perfect. It contained codes and abbreviations that only a historian of that specific era would know. The decree numbers referenced in the threats were real legal statutes on the books in 1933. If this was a hoax, it was perpetrated by someone with access to 60-year-old blank telegram paper, vintage typewriters, and a PhD in fascist administrative law. The probability of authenticity is overwhelming. So we have the order, silence. We have the cover story, meteor. And we have the threat, death or worse. But what about the people on the ground? The telegrams were for the officials, the prefects, the newspaper editors. What about the farmers in Magenta? What about the workers who loaded the craft onto the trucks? This is where the OVRA comes in. The OVRA was the secret police. They were the men in the long leather coats. In the days following the crash, a sanitization operation took place that rivals anything we've ever heard about Roswell. Witnesses were visited. They weren't just told to be quiet, they were threatened with the destruction of their families. In a totalitarian state, you don't need a Men in Black memory wiping device. You just need to remind a father that his children go to a state school and his wife works a state job. Fear is the ultimate neuralizer. The physical evidence was scrubbed. The crater was filled. The mud was turned over. The trucks moved out under the cover of darkness, likely heading toward the SIAI Marchetti facilities in Vergette. But the telegrams reveal one more crucial detail: the involvement of the Brera Astronomical Observatory in Milan. Why involve astronomers if you think it's a secret weapon? This is the crack in the French weapon theory. At some level, even in the first few days, someone suspected this wasn't just a plane. You don't call an astronomer to look at a downed bomber. You call an astronomer when you think something came from outside. The telegrams hint at a confusion, a cognitive dissonance within the regime. They are calling it an aircraft in one breath and a celestial phenomenon in the next. They are caught between two terrified explanations. Either our human enemies have outpaced us, or we are dealing with something not human at all. This duality, the weapon versus the alien, would plague the investigation for years. It would lead to the creation of the secret group we will explore. But for now, in the summer of 1933, the lid was slammed shut. The newspapers printed the meteor story. The public by and large bought it, or if they didn't, they knew better than to say otherwise. The Magenta event vanished from history. It didn't appear in the history books. It didn't appear in the memoirs of the generals. It was effectively deleted. Until 1996, the question we have to ask ourselves is, who was Mr. X? Who kept these telegrams safe for 60 years? The source claimed to be a family member of a collaborator of Italo Balbo. Balbo was one of Mussolini's top men, the Marshal of the Air Force. He was a hero, an aviator, a man who knew the skies better than anyone. If anyone knew the truth about the crash, it was Balbo. The fact that these telegrams survived in a personal archive suggests that even the top fascists knew this was insurance. They kept the proof. Maybe they thought they could use it. Maybe they just couldn't bring themselves to destroy the evidence of the greatest discovery in human history. Whatever the reason, the wall of silence that Mussolini built was perfect for decades. It survived the war. It survived the fall of fascism. It survived the Allied occupation. But walls have cracks, and the pressure of the truth is immense. Mussolini used fear to edit the year 1933. He tried to delete the visitors, but he made a mistake. He didn't destroy the wreckage. He kept it. He studied it. He tried to harness it. And by doing so, he didn't just hide a secret. He started an arms race. A race not for territory, but for the physics of the universe itself. The silence was absolute, but the activity behind the scenes was frantic. The telegrams stopped the press, but they started the scientists. The press was silent. The public was blind. But in the laboratories of Lombardy, the eyes of science were wide open, staring into the abyss of a technology that was thousands of years ahead of its time. Mussolini thought he could control the narrative. He was about to find out that you cannot control what you cannot understand. And so, in the weeks following the June 13th crash, a new entity was born. A phantom organization that existed outside the regular military hierarchy, outside the academic mainstream, and certainly outside the public eye. It was called Cabinet RS-33. The RS stood for Ricerche Speciali, Special Research. The 33 was the year of its inception. It sounds bureaucratic, doesn't it? Mundane. But this was the first government-sponsored UFO crash retrieval and reverse engineering program in human history. Long before Project Blue Book, long before MJ-12, there was RS-33. But who was in this cabinet? This is where the story shifts. Mussolini couldn't just pick loyal party members for this. He needed minds that could grapple with physics that defied Newton. According to the documents leaked to Roberto Pinotti, the man chosen to lead this group was none other than Guglielmo Marconi. Marconi wasn't just a scientist in Italy, he was a god. He was the inventor of the radio, a Nobel Prize winner, the man who had shrunk the world by sending wireless signals across the Atlantic. In 1933, he was the president of the Royal Academy of Italy. He was the Elon Musk, the Oppenheimer, and the Einstein of his era wrapped into one. But why pick Marconi? Because the craft found in Magenta didn't have propellers. It didn't have an engine in the conventional sense. It was silent. It hummed. To the fascist leadership, this suggested one thing: electromagnetism. If this machine moved without fuel, it must be moving on waves. And who was the master of waves? Marconi. The inclusion of Marconi gives this story a weight that is hard to dismiss. If this were a hoax, why pick Marconi? He was a busy public figure. It's a risky narrative choice, but historically it fits perfectly. Marconi was close to the regime, yet he was a man of science first. He had the clearance, the intellect, and the resources to hide a project of this scale. So let's go to the hangar. The location is the SIAI Marchetti facility in Vergit, near Varese. This was the Lockheed Skunk Works of Italy. It was where the fastest seaplanes in the world were built. Secure, remote, filled with the best metallurgical equipment the 1930s had to offer. Imagine the scene. The Bell, that 30-foot, seamless, grayish metal object, is sitting in a restricted hangar. Floodlights are trained on it. Armed guards from the OVRA are at the doors. Inside, men are walking around it. They are holding Geiger counters, calipers, and notebooks. What did they find? The documents suggest a deep, pervasive frustration. You have to remember the context. These men were engineers of the nuts and bolts era. They understood rivets, welding, steel, and aluminum. They understood combustion. The Magenta craft insulted their understanding of the world. The reports describe a material that looked like metal but didn't behave like it. It was cold to the touch. It didn't reflect light in the way aluminum did. There were no seams, no rivets. How do you build a 30-foot object without a single weld? To an engineer in 1933, this was magic. They tried to open it. We don't have the specific details of how they breached the interior, or if the crash had already cracked it open. But the sketches provided in the Pinotti documents show internal structures. They found tubes, and they found coils. This seemed to reinforce the secret weapon theory. They looked at these internal components and saw a radio. They saw a transmitter. Mussolini was convinced that this was a remote-controlled plane developed by the British or the French to spy on Italy. This is a crucial point of divergence. The Americans at Roswell, 14 years later, would almost immediately jump to the extraterrestrial hypothesis because the culture had changed. Sci-fi was bigger and the idea of space travels was closer. But in 1933 Italy, the idea of Martians was for comic books. The men of RS-33 were looking for a terrestrial explanation. They were trying to fit a square alien peg into a round geopolitical hole. Marconi, however, might have seen further. There are persistent rumors, shadows within the shadows, that Marconi realized earlier than anyone else that this was not of Earth. He was obsessed with radio signals from space. In the years prior to the crash, he had claimed to detect signals that he believed were from Mars. When he stood before the Magenta craft, did he recognize it? Did he realize that the radio waves he was hunting were actually the propulsion system of a starship? The work of RS-33 wasn't just about looking at the object, it was about replicating it. Mussolini wanted a fleet of these things. He wanted the death ray that rumors said Marconi was building. He wanted a weapon that would make the Roman Empire reborn. But they hit a wall, the wall of physics. You cannot reverse engineer an iPhone if you are a blacksmith. You might figure out that the glass is glass and the metal is metal. You might even realize that the battery holds charge. But you will never ever figure out the microchip. You don't have the microscope. You don't have the theoretical framework to understand binary code, let alone the ability to see it. That was the tragedy of RS-33. They were blacksmiths staring at a quantum computer. They analyzed the metals. They likely found alloys that were impossible to forge in a standard blast furnace. Magnesium-heavy blends, perhaps similar to what was later found at other crash sites. They cataloged the shape, they drew the schematics. But they couldn't turn it on. And this failure bred paranoia. As the years dragged on, 1934, 1935, and 1936, Mussolini's patience wore thin. If his best scientists couldn't figure it out, maybe someone else could. This leads us to the German connection. There is evidence that as the Rome-Berlin axis strengthened, information began to bleed across the Alps. We will cover the Nazi connection in depth, but it's important to note here that RS-33 wasn't operating in a total vacuum. The frustration of the Italians might have been the catalyst that tipped off the Germans. But let's stay in the hangar. Let's stay with the mystery of the craft itself. One of the most disturbing aspects of the RS-33 files is the reference to the internal makeup of the craft. As they probed deeper into the machine, the line between technology and biology began to blur. In 1933, a machine was a machine. It had gears, pistons, wires. It was dead matter animated by energy. But the sketches and the fragmented notes hint at something else. They hint at a craft that possessed organic qualities. Was the hull self-repairing? Did the controls respond to touch in a way that suggested a neural interface? There is a specific detail regarding the seats or the pilot interface. They were not designed for a human frame. They were too small. The ergonomics were wrong. And then, there is the matter of the pilots themselves. While Grusch and the official U.S. reports focus on the hardware, the Italian documents from the RS-33 era contain sketches of bodies, 2 of them. They were preserved in formaldehyde, kept in a secure location, possibly the University of Milan, or a darker, colder basement in the RS-33 complex. The scientists labeled them. They measured their craniums. They looked at the lack of hair, the pale skin, the large eyes, and they made a terrifying categorization. They didn't call them aliens, and they didn't call them grays. They called them Germanic, because they were blonde or light pigmented, tall, in some accounts, though others say small, and because the Italians were so locked into the idea that this was a foreign weapon, they assumed these were genetically modified pilots created by a Nordic power. Imagine the horror of that, looking at a dead alien entity and thinking, my God, the Germans are breeding monsters. This misunderstanding fueled the war, and it fueled the alliance. Mussolini was terrified of Hitler's Supermen because he thought he had 2 of them on ice in a freezer in Lombardy. RS-33 became a prison of its own making. They had the evidence of the millennium, but they were interpreting it through the lens of their own geopolitical nightmares. They were studying the stars, but they were looking at the ground. By 1939, the clouds of war were breaking. The secrets of RS-33 were about to be put at risk. The facility at Verjot was a target. The files in Rome were vulnerable. As the bombs began to fall on Europe, the men of RS-33 had to make a choice. They had failed to build their own saucer. Now their only goal was to keep the original from being destroyed, or worse yet, falling into the wrong hands. But there was a realization dawning on Marconi, perhaps just before his death in 1937. A realization that he may have whispered to a few trusted colleagues, or perhaps to the Pope himself. The realization that the weapon wasn't a weapon at all. It was a lifeboat, or perhaps a probe. And the silence of the craft wasn't because it was broken. It was because it was waiting. The Cabinet of Shadows had done its work. They had documented the impossible. But as the fascist regime began to crumble under the weight of its own hubris, the control of the secret began to slip. Mussolini lost his grip. The Germans came knocking, asking to see the Italian belle, and the Allies were pushing up from the south. And caught in the middle was the Vatican. The Church had been watching, and being one of the oldest intelligence networks on Earth, they knew about RS-33, they knew about the crash, and they knew something that Mussolini didn't. That if this technology was what they thought it was, it didn't belong to Italy, and it most certainly didn't belong to Germany. It belonged to God or to the devil, and they were determined to make sure it ended up with the righteous. The truth is in the archives. You just have to know which language to read it in. We leave the laboratory and enter the war room. We are going to explore how the Magenta crash didn't just confuse scientists, it drove the geopolitical paranoia that set the stage for World War II. We are going to look at the ghost of the Axis, the terrifying belief that drove Benito Mussolini to his doom, the belief that the enemy already had the ultimate weapon. To understand this, we have to look at the map of 1933. Italy was surrounded. To the north, the rising power of Hitler's Germany. To the west, the French Republic. To the northwest, the British Empire. Mussolini's rhetoric was all about restoring the glory of Rome, but privately, his generals knew the truth. Italy was industrially backward compared to its neighbors. So when a bell-shaped, wingless craft crashes in Lombardy, and his scientists tell him, "We can't replicate this," Mussolini's mind doesn't go to the stars, it goes to Paris. He becomes convinced that the unknown aircraft is a French secret weapon. This sounds absurd to us now. We know the French didn't have anti-gravity drives in 1933. But in the context of the era, it was a terrifyingly plausible nightmare. The 1930s were the age of the mystery airships. There were reports all over Europe of ghost flyers, unmarked aircraft flying at impossible speeds. Mussolini connected the dots. He thought the French had cracked the code of silent propulsion. This paranoia changed everything. Historians often debate why Mussolini allied himself so closely with Hitler, despite initially distrusting him. The Magenta crash adds a new dark variable to that equation. If Mussolini believed he was technologically outgunned by the French and British, who he assumed shared this tech, He needed a powerful friend. He needed the German war machine. But here is where the story gets truly twisted. As the years ticked by, 1936, 1937, 1938, RS-33 continued to fail. They couldn't start the engine. They couldn't cut the metal. The death ray that Marconi was rumored to be building remained a blueprint, a fantasy fueled by the desperate hope that they could weaponize the UFO's power source. Mussolini, realizing his scientists were stalled, began to look north. We know from the historical record that technology transfers between Italy and Germany accelerated in the late 30s. But did they share the secret of the bell? There are fragments of evidence, testimony from Italian officials, and later admissions by German scientists that suggest a delegation was sent. German engineers, possibly associated with the Luftwaffe or the SS technical branch, were invited to the Verjet hangars. Imagine the scene: Nazi officers in their crisp uniforms, walking around the magenta object. They are arrogant, confident in German engineering superiority. They likely looked at the Italian scientists with disdain. You can't figure this out, we will. But they couldn't either. However, the exposure to the magenta craft might have been the spark that lit the fuse of the Nazi wonder weapon programs. We have all heard the legends of Die Glocke, the bell, the alleged Nazi anti-gravity device developed by SS General Hans Kammler in the dying days of the war. For decades, researchers have treated the Nazi bell as a separate mystery. But look at the description of the Italian craft. Bell-shaped, flat and circular. Is it possible that Die Glocke wasn't an original German invention, but an attempt to replicate what they saw in Italy? Did the Germans take the data, the sketches, and perhaps samples of the metal back to the secret labs in Silesia? Did they succeed where Marconi had failed? The timing aligns. The German research into advanced propulsion kicks into high gear after the Axis alliance is solidified. They start building disc-shaped aircraft prototypes, like the SAC AS-6, even though it is primitive, and they start working on implosion physics. Mussolini, for his part, was playing a dangerous game of poker. He entered World War II in 1940, thinking that even if his army was weak, he held a wild card. He thought that maybe, just maybe, RS-33 would have a breakthrough. He thought he could unleash a fleet of electric saucers that would sweep the Royal Navy out of the Mediterranean. It was a delusion born of a misunderstanding of what he had locked in his hangar. He wasn't fighting a technological war against France. He was hoarding a piece of cosmic history that he was too primitive to use. As the war turned against Italy, as the bombs began to fall on Milan and Turin, the paranoia shifted. It wasn't just about weaponizing the craft anymore. It was about hiding it. The Allies were coming. The British were bombing the industrial north. The SIAI Marchetti factory was a prime target. What do you do with a 30-foot alien spaceship when your country is burning down around you? You have to move it or bury it. But the ghost of the Axis had one final trick to play. By 1943, Mussolini had been deposed, then rescued by Hitler, and installed as the puppet leader of the Republic of Salo in northern Italy. He was a broken man, but he still held the keys to the hangar. And now the Germans weren't just guests. They were occupiers. The Nazis began to loot Italy. They took art, they took gold, and they took machinery. It is highly probable that in these final chaotic years, the SS took total control of the Magenta project. The Italian scientists of RS-33 were likely sidelined or forced to work at gunpoint. The French weapon theory was dead. They knew by now that no human on Earth had built this. The pilots found in 1933 the Nordic bodies were now being reevaluated. If they weren't French, were they Aryans? This is the most disturbing psychological aspect of the Nazi connection. Did the SS look at those Nordic alien bodies and see a reflection of their own twisted ideology? Did they believe they had found the sky gods of their occult mythology? The Magenta crash didn't just start an arms race, it fueled a spiritual madness in the heart of the Third Reich. But while the fascists and the Nazis were obsessed with power, there was another player on the board. A player who didn't care about wonder weapons or racial purity. A player who cared about the soul of mankind. In Rome, the Vatican was watching. The Pope knew about the crash. He knew about the bodies. And as the Axis crumbled, he realized that this technology was too dangerous to be left in the ruins of Europe. The ghost of the Axis was fading, and the shadow of the cross was rising. In the next section, we are going to leave the war-torn airfields of northern Italy and enter the hushed corridors of the Vatican secret archives. We are going to find out how Pope Pius XII became the most unlikely whistleblower in history. Mussolini thought the UFO was a weapon. The Nazis thought it was a blueprint. The Pope? He thought it was a warning. And he picked up the phone to call the only people left who could secure it, the Americans. The magenta object, the bell, was sitting in a hangar in Vergette, a prize waiting to be claimed by the victors. But who would those victors be? In 1944, that wasn't entirely clear. The Soviet Red Army was pushing from the east. The Americans and British were pushing from the west and south. Europe was being carved up. We often think of the Vatican as purely a religious institution, but we must remember, it is also a state. It has diplomats. It has spies. The Jesuits, often called God's Marines, have been gathering intelligence for centuries. The Vatican knew about the Magenta crash from the very beginning. Italy is their backyard. You don't hide a spaceship in Lombardy without a priest hearing about it in confession. The Pope's concern wasn't technological. It was theological, yes, but primarily geopolitical. He looked at the map. He saw the godless communists of the Soviet Union. He saw the pagan neo-heathens of Nazi Germany. Both were existential threats to the church. If Stalin got his hands on the Magenta technology, on a power source that could render oil obsolete, on a weapon that could dominate the sky, the church feared a darkness that would last 1,000 years. And so the Vatican made a choice. They chose the lesser of evils. They chose the United States. This brings us to one of the most explosive claims made by whistleblower David Grusch in 2023. He stated, on the record, under oath, that the Vatican back-channeled the existence of the craft to the United States. This isn't a conspiracy theory from a Reddit board. This is testimony presented to the U.S. Congress under oath. But how did they do it? The channel was likely the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. The OSS had a strong presence in Rome. There were deep ties between American intelligence and the Vatican, forged in the common fire of anti-communism and anti-fascism. Imagine the meeting. It wouldn't be in a grand hall. It would be in a quiet garden or a nondescript library room. A Monsignor, perhaps a member of the Vatican's Secretariat of State, meeting with an OSS operative like James Jesus Angleton, who ran the Italy desk and would later become the CIA's counterintelligence chief. The message was simple but earth-shattering. The fascists found something in 1933. It is not of this world. It is currently in Vergette. The Germans are trying to move it. You must get there first. Why would the Pope do this? Because the Church, contrary to popular belief, is pragmatic. They had dealt with the question of plurality of worlds for centuries. The idea of aliens didn't necessarily break Catholic theology, but the idea of Stalin with an alien death ray, that broke everything. The Vatican acted as the broker of the most important asset transfer in history. They provided the coordinates, they provided the names of the scientists involved, the remnants of RS-33. They likely provided the translations of the Stefani telegrams and the research notes. This back channel explains so much about the post-war era. It explains why the U.S. military rushed into northern Italy with such precision. It explains why the Monuments Men, the units tasked with recovering art, were often accompanied by technical intelligence teams tasked with recovering hardware. They weren't just looking for Da Vinci paintings, they were looking for the bell. But there is a deeper mystery here. What did the Pope know about the occupants? If the RS-33 files contained autopsy reports of Nordic beings, did the Church view them as biological entities? Or did they view them through a spiritual lens? Angels, demons, or simply other children of God? There is a document, controversial, debated but persistent, attributed to the Vatican archives that refers to the thing. It suggests a secret treaty or understanding. The Church decided that humanity wasn't ready, that the revelation of non-human intelligence would cause chaos, and that only the enemies of the faith would benefit from. So, they helped the Americans bury it. They handed the truth to the U.S. government, trusting that America would be a responsible custodian. A trust that arguably led to the creation of the military-industrial complex. The Vatican's role was the bridge. They bridged the gap between the Old World, fascist Italy, and the New World, the American superpower. They took the secrets of 1933 and securely deposited them into the vaults of 1945. As the war in Europe ended, the race was on. The Germans were retreating. The RS won. Mussolini's final government was collapsing. The partisans were in the streets. And somewhere in the chaos, a special U.S. recovery team was moving toward Vergit, guided by a map provided by a priest. They were about to conduct the first crash retrieval of the Cold War era, but the object they were retrieving wasn't a Soviet satellite, it was the Magenta craft. The Pope had done his part. Now it was up to the soldiers. The Vatican whispered the secret, and the Americans were about to steal the show. History is written by the victors, but the secrets are kept by the silent. The year is 1945. The 1,000-year Reich is burning. Mussolini is dead, his body hanging upside down in a square in Milan, a gruesome symbol of a failed empire. The war is effectively over, but for a small, elite group of American intelligence officers, the real mission is just beginning. While the world was celebrating VE Day, a silent race was taking place in the shadows of the Italian Alps, a race between the Americans, the British, the Soviets, and the remaining die-hard Nazis. The prize wasn't territory, it was the bell. The craft was located at the SIAI Marchetti facilities in Vergit. By April 1945, this area was a chaotic mix of retreating German troops, vengeful Italian partisans, and advancing Allied armor. The danger was extreme. If a stray shell hit that hangar, the evidence would be vaporized. If a German commander decided to rig the facility with explosives, a standard scorched earth tactic, the technology would be lost forever. Enter the Office of Strategic Services and the Counterintelligence Corps. We know that specialized teams were embedded with the advancing units. We often hear about the Monuments Men, the heroes who saved Europe's art from the Nazis. But there was another group, less famous but equally vital, the technical intelligence teams. Their job was to scour German and Italian labs for advanced tech, jet engines, rockets, and radar. But for the team heading to Vergit, the shopping list didn't say jet engine, it said artifact. According to the historical reconstruction supported by Grusch's testimony and the Pinotti documents, the Americans arrived just in time. The facility was secured. The hangar doors were thrown open, and there it was, dusty, silent, surrounded by 12 years of failure. The Magenta craft sat there, a riddle that fascism couldn't solve. You've been fighting panzers. You've seen the horrors of war, and suddenly you are standing in front of a 30-foot, seamless, bell-shaped object that looks like it flew out of a Flash Gordon comic strip. Then the order comes down, pack it up. How do you move a UFO? You can't fly it. You can't just tow it down the road like a broken Jeep. It's too big, and more importantly, it's too distinct. If a convoy of trucks drives through Milan carrying a giant saucer, the secret is out before it even leaves the country. The retrieval required a shell game. The object was likely dismantled, or if it was solid, it was crated in a way that disguised its shape. Huge wooden crates, stamped with captured enemy equipment or aviation parts, the ultimate camouflage. In a war zone, nobody questions a crate of airplane parts. The convoy would have moved under heavy guard, not regular MPS but intelligence officers. They would have driven to a port, likely Genoa or Naples, where a ship was waiting. But they didn't just take the craft, they took the paper. This is a crucial detail. The physical object is useless without the documentation. They took the sketches, the metallurgical analysis, the telegrams. They took the Nordic bodies, and they took the scientists. This is the beginning of Operation Paperclip. We usually associate Paperclip with German scientists like Werner von Braun, but the net was cast wide. Italian engineers who had worked on the Magenta project were invited to continue their work in the United States. They were given a choice: stay in a ruined country that views you as a fascist collaborator, or come to America, live in the sun, and work on the most advanced technology in the universe. It wasn't a hard choice. By late 1945, the Magenta craft had left European soil. It crossed the Atlantic, sitting in the hold of a Liberty ship or a Navy transport. Bobbing on the waves of an ocean it had likely flown over in seconds. But where did it go? The trail goes cold at the U.S. shoreline, but educated speculation points to Wright Field, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. This was the hub of foreign technology analysis. It's where they took the German 262 jets and the V-2 rockets. And it's where, according to legend, the Blue Room is located, the final resting place of the most dangerous artifacts on Earth. Imagine the scene at Wright Field. The crates are opened. The American engineers gather around. They are confident they just won the war. They built the atomic bomb. They think they can figure anything out. But as they stare at the Magenta craft, the same silence that filled the hangar in Italy fills the hangar in Ohio. They realize that the Italians didn't fail because they were incompetent. They failed because the problem is impossible. The arrival of the Magenta craft in the U.S. changed the trajectory of American history. It happened before Roswell. This is key. When the Roswell crash happened 2 years later in 1947, the U.S. military didn't panic because they saw a flying saucer. They panicked because they saw another one. They already knew they were real. They already had one in the garage. Roswell was just confirmation that the visitors were still here, and they were crashing with alarming frequency. The retrieval was a success. The Vatican was relieved. The godless powers didn't get the tech. The Americans were emboldened. They now held the ultimate trump card. Because while the Americans got the hardware, but the rumors persisted that the Germans had managed to steal the idea. For decades, the internet and French history books have been obsessed with Nazi UFOs. The idea that Hitler had flying saucers. The story that refuses to die. And that story has a ring of truth now that we know about Magenta. Let's look at the description of the Nazi bell, as popularized by military journalist Nick Cook and researcher Igor Witkowski. It was described as a bell-shaped metallic object, roughly 9 to 12 feet wide and 12 to 15 feet high. It glowed violet when active, and it made a buzzing sound. Now rewind to 1933, Magenta, Italy. What did the locals find? A bell-shaped object, a flattened bell. Is it a coincidence, or is it a paper trail? Here is the theory that weaves history and conspiracy into a single cohesive narrative. The Nazis didn't invent the bell. They copied it. We know that Mussolini and Hitler became allies. We know that technology transfer was a huge part of that alliance. The Italians gave the Germans torpedo technology. The Germans gave the Italians radar. It is highly probable that at some point after 1936, Mussolini, frustrated by RS-33's failure, let the Germans in on the secret. He opened the doors of the Vergiate hangar to the SS technical branch. Enter General Hans Kammler. Kammler is one of the most mysterious figures of the war. He was the head of the SS construction projects. He built the concentration camps, but he also built the V-2 underground factories. By the end of the war, he was in charge of all special weapons research. If anyone saw the Magenta craft, it was Kammler. Imagine the German engineers looking at the Italian find. They are more advanced than the Italians. They have Werner von Braun. They have the best physicists in the world. They look at the Magenta craft and they think, we can build this. But they couldn't simply reverse engineer it. The materials were too alien. The power source was incomprehensible. So they tried to mimic it. This is the crucial distinction. Die Glocke wasn't an alien craft. It was a human attempt to build an alien craft using 1940s technology. Instead of the silent electromagnetic drive of the Magenta object, the Nazis used high-voltage electricity and rotating mercury, the famous Zerum 525. They tried to use brute force to achieve what the aliens achieved with elegance. This explains why the Nazi bell was so dangerous. Reports say it killed several scientists during testing. It emitted radiation that gelled organic matter. It was a crude, dirty, human approximation of a technology they didn't understand. The connection between Magenta and the Nazi bell solves the origin problem. Skeptics always ask, if the Nazis had UFOs, why did they lose the war? Why didn't they bomb London with saucers? The answer is simple. Because they didn't have UFOs. They had a broken prototype based on a misunderstood Italian discovery. They were trying to hotwire a Ferrari with a screwdriver, and they never got it out of first gear. But the legend grew. As the war ended, Hans Kammler disappeared. vanished. Some say he died. Others say he made a deal. And this brings us back to the Americans. When the US recovered the Magenta craft in 1945, they also captured the German scientists who had worked on the Bell project. They had both halves of the puzzle. They had the original alien artifact from Italy, and they had the German data on how to try to build one. This convergence of data, the Italian hardware, and the German theory formed the bedrock of the US secret space program. The US didn't start from scratch. They started with a cheat code. But what happened to the RS-33 files? While the Americans took the bulk of the data, it is believed that some copies remained in Italy, hidden in family safes, buried in gardens. These are the documents that eventually found their way to Mr. X and Roberto Pinotti. The Nazi connection serves as a dark mirror to the Magenta story. It shows us what happens when humanity tries to seize the power of the gods without the wisdom to control it. The Italians froze in fear. The Nazis burned themselves trying to touch the fire, and the Americans, they took the fire home. For 90 years, this story was just that, a story, a rumor, a piece of folklore shared by Italian ufologists and dismissed by serious historians. The Magenta crash was considered a fringe theory within a fringe field. Without hard evidence, without a body, without a craft, it was easy to ignore. That was until June 2023, until a man raised his right hand, swore an oath before the United States Congress, and shattered the timeline of history. Today we are going to look at the smoking gun. We are going to analyze the testimony that brought the Magenta crash out of the shadows and into the congressional record. He was a high-ranking intelligence officer, a veteran of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, and the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO. He was the man cleared to see the secrets. He was the co-lead for the UAP analysis within the Department of Defense. His job was literally to find the truth. His name was David Grusch, and when he came forward, he didn't just talk about lights in the sky. He talked about crash retrievals, and he talked about biologics. But the bombshell, the specific detail that made historians gasp, was his mention of 1933. In his interviews and his testimony, he was specific. He stated that the United States is in possession of a craft recovery that dates back to Mussolini's Italy. He explicitly named the Vatican as the entity that facilitated the transfer. In 1996, Roberto Pinotti received the anonymous Mr. X telegrams mentioning RS-33 and the retrieval. In 2023, a U.S. intelligence official with no connection to Pinotti confirms that the U.S. government has a craft from 1933 Italy involving the Vatican. These are two independent data points separated by 27 years and an ocean apart. The fact that they align perfectly is not a coincidence. It is corroboration. His testimony validates the Mr. X documents. It suggests that the telegrams Pinotti received were real. It also suggests that the sketches of the bell-shaped craft were accurate. Skeptics often claim that UFOs are a cultural product of the atomic age. They say we started seeing saucers in 1947 because we were afraid of nuclear war and influenced by sci-fi movies. But if a craft crashed in 1933, that theory evaporates. There were no atomic bombs in 1933. There were no flying saucer movies in 1933. The term UFO didn't exist. It means the phenomenon is not a projection of our fears. It is a physical reality that predates our modern obsession with it. It means they were here before we could even radar them. He also touched on the shape. He described the Italian craft as bell-like or saucer-like. This matches the 1933 descriptions of the flattened bell. It matches the Die Glock rumors. This consistency is the hallmark of truth. If he were making it up, he could have said Roswell was real. That's an easy lie. But to say 1933, Italy is a specific, obscure, and verifiable detail. It's a detail you only know if you've read the classified historical briefs. But the revelations force us to ask a question. Where is it now? If the U.S. military took possession of a 30-foot craft in 1945, and they have had it for nearly 80 years, what have they done with it? Have they cracked the code? Have they been inside? According to Dr. James Lakatsky, we have opened it and we have been inside. Grusch implies that we have been in a Cold War for alien technology for decades. He suggests that the US, Russia, and China are all vying for these scraps of advanced physics. But the 1933 craft is the crown jewel. It was the first. It was the most complete. And because it crashed before the age of digital sensors and satellites, it was the easiest to hide. The Magenta event is no longer just an Italian mystery. It is an American secret. It sits in a hangar, perhaps at Wright-Patterson, perhaps at Area 51, or perhaps in a private aerospace facility, Lockheed Martin, that doesn't officially exist. It sits there, a silent rebuke to our history books. He didn't just blow the whistle on the legacy program. He told us that the history we learned in school is incomplete. He told us that while our grandfathers were fighting fascism, a small group of men were fighting to understand a technology that makes fascism look like a tribal squabble. The validation is here. The witness has spoken, and the documents match. The only thing missing is the object itself. What does it mean for us today? If the world has been visited since 1933, what does it mean for religion, for science, and for the future of humanity? The cover-up has lasted 90 years, but the whistle has been blown, and now we have to deal with the noise. History is a set of lies agreed upon, but the future is a truth we are not yet ready to accept. We have come a long way. We started in a misty field in Lombardy, standing over a shattered bell. We ended in the halls of the U.S. Congress, listening to a man risk his freedom to tell us that the bell is real. We have pieced together a mosaic that changes everything. We call this the Magenta paradigm. It is a shift in our understanding of reality. For decades, we have operated under the Roswell paradigm, the idea that UFOs arrived in 1947, triggered by our atomic hubris. That narrative places humanity at the center. We split the atom, so they came to watch. The Magenta paradigm tells a different story. It tells us that they were already here. They were here when we were still flying biplanes. They were here before we had the power to destroy ourselves. It suggests that the phenomenon is not a reaction to us. It is a permanent feature of our environment. Let's look at the implications of a 90-year cover-up. If the U.S. government has possessed this technology since 1945, it means that every major geopolitical event of the last century has a shadow dimension. The Cold War wasn't just about capitalism versus communism. It was a race to see who could reverse engineer the artifacts first. The space race wasn't just about the moon. It was about developing the rocketry to intercept these visitors, or perhaps to hide the fact that we were already working with their physics. And then there is the energy question. If the Magenta craft used an electromagnetic propulsion system, zero-point energy, or anti-gravity, then why have we sat on the solution to the climate crisis for 80 years? We have burned oil and coal, polluting our planet, while the answer sat in a classified box in Ohio. That is the crime. Not the secrecy of aliens, but the secrecy of progress. And what of the Vatican? The Church emerges from this story not as a villain, but as the ultimate keeper of the flame. They understood that knowledge is dangerous without wisdom. They hid the Magenta craft because they saw what men like Mussolini and Hitler would do with it. But the Vatican archives are vast. If they knew about Magenta, what else do they know? Do they have records of crashes from 1890, from 1500, from the Roman Empire? The Magenta paradigm suggests that the Vatican is the oldest intelligence agency on Earth, and their files on non-human intelligence might make the CIA's look like a pamphlet. So as we close out this episode, we have to look forward. David Grusch has opened the door. The Mr. X documents have provided the map. The testimony is on the record, but the craft is still missing. The Magenta UFO, the Bell of 1933, is the holy grail of ufology. It is the physical proof that would end the debate forever. It is likely still out there, hidden under a different name, buried under a different project, foreign technology, exotic material, or nuclear material. The people who recovered it in 1945 are gone. The scientists of RS-33 are dust. Mussolini is a footnote, but the object remains. Metal that doesn't rust, technology that doesn't age. We are living in a time of disclosure, and the dam is breaking. The Magenta story teaches us that the truth is stranger, darker, and more complex than we ever imagined. It teaches us that our governments have been managing a reality that they don't fully understand. So what do? We must demand the files. We must demand the declassification of the OSS records from 1944 and 1945 regarding Task Force A and the retrieval operations in northern Italy. We must demand the Vatican open its secret archives regarding Pope Pius XII and his communications with the U.S. regarding celestial phenomena. The story of the Magenta crash is the story of the 20th century. It is the story of how we lost our innocence, not to a war but to a realization. We are not alone, and we have never really been alone. And somewhere hidden away out there, the bell is still waiting to ring. Keep looking up, but more importantly, keep digging for the truth. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and thank you for questioning the narrative. As we step back from the crossroads, remember the story doesn't end here, because this is just the beginning, searching for the knowledge and wisdom to unravel the mysteries of our universe. Unexplained sightings, spirits, and science. They are all connected in the grand tapestry of life. So remember, keep pulling at the threads, because this has been Crossroads of the Veil.